The sound of thunder hooves against packed earth echoed through Copper Canyon long before anyone could see what was causing the commotion. Elena Vasquez gripped the reins of her mare with white knuckles, her 18-month-old daughter Sofia pressed tight against her chest as the horse beneath them fought every step forward. Lightning had spooked Estrella 3 miles back, and now the normally gentle mare was half wild with fear, nostrils flaring and eyes rolling white as she danced sideways down the main street of the small Arizona town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's dark hair had long since escaped its braid, whipping around her face as she struggled to maintain control. Her traveling dress, once a respectable shade of burgundy, was now dusty and torn at the sleeve, where a thorny mesquite branch had caught her during their chaotic ride through the desert. Baby Sofia whimpered against her mother's shoulder, sensing the tension that radiated through Elena's body like a taut wire about to snap. The year was 1892, and Elena had been riding hard for 2 days straight, stopping only when absolutely necessary to feed Sofia or rest the increasingly agitated horse. Behind them, somewhere in the vast expanse of New Mexico territory, lay the ruins of everything she had once called home. Ahead, in this dusty frontier town that seemed to shimmer like a mirage in the late afternoon heat, lay her only hope for sanctuary. Estrella reared suddenly, her front hooves pawing at the air as a tumbleweed blew across their path. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she fought to stay mounted, her free arm tightening protectively around Sofia. The baby's whimpers turned to frightened cries, and Elena found herself murmuring soft Spanish words of comfort, even as her own voice trembled with exhaustion and fear. She had exactly $47 sewn into the lining of her corset, 3 days' worth of hardtack and dried beef in her saddlebags, and nowhere left to run. The men who had burned her family's ranch would not stop looking for her, not when she carried the only proof of their crimes tucked safely in her belongings. But first, she had to find a way to calm her horse and secure shelter for the night. The main street of Copper Canyon stretched before them like a gauntlet of curious eyes and whispered conversations. Elena could feel the weight of every stare as townspeople emerged from storefronts and saloons to witness the spectacle of a young Mexican woman on a panicked horse, clutching a crying baby. Some faces showed concern, others suspicion, and a few displayed the kind of cold calculation that made Elena's blood run cold with remembered terror. Estrella suddenly bolted toward the town's livery stable, perhaps drawn by the familiar scent of hay and grain. Elena had no choice but to hold on as the mare careened between a parked wagon and a water trough, sending chickens scattering in a flurry of feathers and indignant squawking. The stable door stood open, revealing the cool shadows within, and for a moment Elena dared to hope that her mount would finally settle. Instead, Estrella came to a sudden, jarring halt just outside the stable entrance, nearly sending Elena tumbling from the saddle. The mare stood trembling, her coat dark with sweat, as if some invisible barrier prevented her from taking another step forward. Sofia's cries had reached a crescendo that seemed to echo off every building in the small town, and Elena felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, as desperation threatened to overwhelm her completely. It was then that a figure emerged from the depths of the stable, moving with the calm, measured pace of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened animals. Elena's first impression was of broad shoulders silhouetted against the golden light filtering through the rear doors, followed by the soft jingle of spurs as the man approached her horse with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Marcus Sullivan had been shoeing horses in the relative quiet of his livery stable when the commotion outside reached his ears. At 32, he had spent enough years working with spooked livestock to recognize the particular quality of fear that turned even the gentlest creatures into dangerous, unpredictable forces. The sound of a baby crying had added an urgency to the situation that sent him dropping his tools and moving toward the stable entrance without hesitation. What he found there stopped him in his tracks, for reasons that had nothing to do with the obviously distressed horse. The woman seated on the trembling mare looked as though she had ridden through hell itself, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination that spoke of someone pushed far beyond their limits. The baby in her arms could not have been more than 1.5 years old, her tiny face red with tears, and her small fists waving in distress. Marcus had seen plenty of desperate travelers pass through Copper Canyon over the years, But something about this particular woman and child stirred memories he had spent the last 5 years trying to forget. Memories of another woman, another child, and the terrible silence that had settled over his life when consumption had taken them both during the harsh winter of 1887. He approached Estrella slowly, his voice pitched low and soothing as he spoke to the animal, in the same tone he might use with a frightened child. The mare's ears flickered toward him, her nostrils still flaring but her wild dancing beginning to settle into nervous shuffling. Marcus could see the quality of the horse beneath the fear and exhaustion, the fine breeding that spoke of careful selection and gentle handling. This was not the mount of a common drifter or outlaw. Elena watched the stranger approach with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. She had learned to read men quickly during her flight across the territories, to distinguish between those who might offer genuine help and those whose assistance would come with a price she was not willing to pay. This man moved with a confidence that suggested strength without aggression, his weathered hands steady as he reached toward Estrella's bridle. He was tall, probably several inches over 6 feet, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent working outdoors. His brown hair was touched with premature silver at the temples, and when he looked up at Elena, she found herself staring into eyes the color of sage honey that held a depth of understanding she had not expected to find in this remote frontier town. "Easy now," Marcus murmured, though Elena could not be certain whether he was speaking to the horse or to her. His hand found Estrella's neck, stroking gently along the sweating coat, as the mare's trembling began to subside. "She's been running hard. When was the last time she had water?" Elena's throat felt parched as she tried to find her voice. She had been speaking only Spanish to Sofia for the past 2 days, and switching back to English required a conscious effort that felt almost foreign after so many hours of fear and flight. "Yesterday morning," she managed, her accent coloring the words despite her efforts to speak clearly. "There was a stream, but she would not drink." "The thunder." Marcus nodded, his expression grave as he took in the extent of the mare's distress. "Thunder spooks them sometimes for days afterward. She's a fine animal, though." "Spanish breeding?" When Elena nodded, he continued stroking Estrella's neck with practiced gentleness. "I can see the Arabian influence in her lines. Someone took good care selecting her bloodline." The casual way he assessed her horse told Elena that this man knew his business, but it also raised questions she was not prepared to answer. The quality of Estrella's breeding was precisely the kind of detail that could identify Elena to the wrong people, should word of her presence spread beyond this small town. She shifted Sofia to her other arm, trying to ease the ache in her shoulders from holding the baby so tightly for so many hours. "She needs rest," Elena said carefully, testing the waters of this stranger's intentions. "Water and grain if it can be arranged. I can pay." The last statement was not entirely true, as her meager funds would not stretch to cover more than the most basic necessities. But pride demanded that she at least make the offer. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion that she could not quite hide beneath her stubborn dignity. The baby in her arms had quieted somewhat, but he could see the way the child's tiny fingers clutched at her mother's torn dress, and the protective way the woman held herself suggested that she had reasons beyond simple travel fatigue for her obvious distress. "Water and grain won't be a problem," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "But this mare isn't going anywhere for at least a day, maybe 2. She's pushed herself about as far as she can go." He paused, watching Elena's face for her reaction. "You and the little one look like you could use some rest yourselves." Elena's first instinct was to refuse any offer of extended hospitality. Staying in one place too long was dangerous, and accepting help from strangers had already proven to be a mistake that had cost her family everything they had built over 3 generations. But Sofia was growing heavier in her arms with each passing moment, and the thought of trying to continue their flight on foot with an 18-month-old child was daunting beyond measure. "I cannot impose," she began, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "No imposition," he replied, beginning to lead Estrella toward the stable entrance. The mare followed willingly now, her earlier panic subsiding into weary compliance. "I've got space in the back for travelers passing through. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and dry." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they moved into the blessed coolness of the stable, Elena found herself studying her unexpected benefactor more closely. The livery was clearly well maintained, with neat rows of stalls and clean straw covering the floor. The scent of leather and horse liniment hung in the air, mixing with the sweeter smell of fresh hay to create an atmosphere that spoke of competent care and attention to detail. Marcus led Estrella to an empty stall near the back of the building, his movements efficient and sure as he began removing the mare's tack. Elena slid down from the saddle with relief, her legs trembling slightly as they took her full weight for the first time in hours. Sofia had finally stopped crying, though she continued to cling to her mother with the desperate grip of a child who had sensed too much adult fear in recent days. "There's a pump out back for washing," Marcus said without looking up from his work with Estrella's bridle. "And I've got coffee on the stove if you're interested. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and strong." The casual offer of hospitality, made without questions or conditions, was so unexpected that Elena felt tears threatening again. She had grown accustomed to suspicion and hostility over the past weeks, to doors closed in her face and demands for payment before any service was rendered. The simple kindness of a cup of coffee offered freely seemed almost too good to be real. "Signor," she began hesitantly, "you do not know me. My name, my business here. It is not wise to trust strangers." Marcus paused in his work, turning to study her face with those unsettling, sage-colored eyes. "Maybe not," he agreed quietly. "But I know a woman and child in need when I see them, and I know the look of someone who's been running from something they'd rather not talk about." He returned his attention to Estrella's tack, his voice matter-of-fact as he continued. "Name's Marcus Sullivan. I run this livery, do some blacksmithing on the side. Been in Copper Canyon about 8 years now." The introduction was clearly an invitation for Elena to reciprocate, but she found herself hesitating. Giving her real name felt dangerous, but lying to this man who was showing her such unexpected kindness seemed equally wrong. In the end, she settled for a partial truth. "Elena," she said simply, "and this is Sofia." She bounced the baby gently, earning a small smile that was Sofia's first in 2 days. "We are traveling to California, to family there." It was not entirely a lie, as Elena did have distant cousins in Los Angeles, though she had no idea whether they would welcome her after so many years without contact. More importantly, California was in the opposite direction from where Diego Morales and his men would expect her to flee, which made it as good a destination as any for the purposes of misdirection. Marcus nodded, apparently accepting her explanation without further question. "Long journey to California, especially with a little one." He finished removing Estrella's saddle, setting it carefully on a wooden rail before beginning to rub down the mare's sweating coat. "How long since she's been fed?" "Yesterday," Elena admitted, watching as he worked with practiced efficiency. "There was grain in my saddlebags, but when the thunder started—" "She probably wouldn't have eaten anyway," Marcus said, understanding her unfinished sentence. "Fear does that to them. But she'll settle down now that she's somewhere safe." He glanced up at Elena. "You both will." The quiet confidence in his voice was strangely comforting, though Elena could not shake the feeling that she was somehow deceiving this kind man by accepting his help. If he knew who she was, what she carried in her belongings, he would not be so quick to offer sanctuary. The thought of bringing danger to his doorstep, as she had inadvertently done to her own family, made her stomach clench with guilt and fear. Sofia began to fuss again, and Elena recognized the particular quality of her daughter's cry that indicated hunger. It had been several hours since their last stop, and the baby's routine had been completely disrupted by their hasty flight. Elena reached into her travel bag for the small jar of mashed food she had prepared that morning, but Sofia turned her face away from the spoon with the obstinate determination of an overtired toddler. "She's been difficult about eating," Elena explained apologetically, as Sofia's fussing threatened to escalate into full crying again. "The travel, the strange places, everything is frightening to her now." Marcus set down his brush and moved closer, his expression thoughtful as he studied the distressed child. "My sister used to have the same trouble with her youngest when they traveled," he said quietly. "Sometimes they just need something familiar, something that feels like home." Without asking permission, he reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew something small and wooden. Elena tensed instinctively, her protective instincts flaring, but relaxed when she saw that he was holding a tiny carved horse, no bigger than his thumb, The craftsmanship was exquisite, with every detail of the animal's form rendered in miniature perfection. "I whittle," Marcus explained with a slight smile, the first Elena had seen from him. "Helps pass the time during the quiet hours." He held the carving out toward Sofia, who stopped crying immediately and reached for it with fascinated fingers. "My nephew always said horses were lucky." Sofia grasped the tiny wooden animal with both hands, examining it with the intense concentration that only small children could bring to a new discovery. For the first time in days, she seemed completely calm, her earlier distress forgotten in the wonder of this unexpected gift. "You did not have to," Elena began, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "Children should have something to hold on to," he said simply. "Something that's just theirs." There was a sadness in his voice that suggested personal experience with the needs of children, though Elena could see no evidence of a family in the tidy bachelor quarters visible through the open door at the back of the stable. With Sofia contentedly occupied with her new treasure, Elena was finally able to coax the baby to eat a few spoonfuls of the mashed food. The sight of her daughter's returning appetite was almost enough to make Elena cry with relief, as it was the first normal thing Sofia had done since their flight began. Marcus finished tending to Estrella and moved on to the evening care of the other horses in his stable, his presence a steady, reassuring constant as Elena tried to process the day's events. The warmth of his stable, the gentle sounds of horses settling for the night, and the simple kindness he had shown to both her and Sofia created an atmosphere of safety that Elena had not experienced in weeks. As the sun began to set outside, painting the stable interior in shades of gold and amber, Marcus finally approached her again. "There's a room in the back," he said, nodding toward the door Elena had noticed earlier. "Nothing fancy, but there's a bed and a basin for washing. You and the little one are welcome to it for the night." Elena looked up at him, this stranger who had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than she had encountered in weeks of travel. "Signor Sullivan," she began formally, "I cannot accept such generosity without offering payment. I have some money." "Keep your money," Marcus interrupted gently. "You'll need it for the road to California." He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "But there is something you could do, if you're of a mind to." Elena stiffened slightly, her wariness returning. She had learned to be suspicious of men who offered help and then revealed their true intentions once a woman was indebted to them. "What would you ask?" Marcus seemed to sense her sudden tension, and his next words were carefully chosen. "I've got a neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who runs the boarding house down the street. She's been asking me to find someone who could help her with the washing and cooking for her guests. She's getting on in years, and the work is getting to be too much for her." He gestured toward Sofia, who was still examining her wooden horse with fascination. "It's the kind of work that would let you keep the little one with you, and Mrs. Chen is good people. Fair wages, honest work." He met Elena's eyes directly. "No questions asked about where you came from or where you're headed." The offer was unexpected, and Elena found herself considering it seriously, despite her instinct to keep moving. A few days of honest work would allow her to replenish her meager funds, and the promise of no questions asked was worth more than money to someone in her position. More importantly, it would give Estrella time to recover from their hard journey, and Sofia needed the stability of a routine more than Elena cared to admit. "This Mrs. Chen," Elena said carefully, "she would not mind Sofia?" "Mrs. Chen raised 6 children of her own," Marcus replied with another of his rare smiles. "She's got grandchildren scattered all over the territory now. I think she'd welcome the sound of a little one around the place." Elena looked down at her daughter, who had finally relaxed completely against her shoulder, the wooden horse clutched securely in her tiny fist. The decision felt momentous, like choosing between continued flight and the possibility of something resembling a normal life, even if only temporarily. "For a few days only," she said finally, "until Estrella is rested and we can continue our journey." Marcus nodded, though something in his expression suggested that he understood more about her situation than his lack of questions implied. "I'll speak to Mrs. Chen in the morning. She'll be glad for the help." As if summoned by their conversation, an elderly Chinese woman appeared in the stable doorway, her small frame moving with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple tasks simultaneously. She wore a practical dark dress with a clean white apron, and her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. "Marcus Sullivan," she said, her English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "I heard there was excitement in the street. Mrs. Patterson came to tell me there was a woman with a baby on a wild horse." Her gaze found Elena and Sofia, and her expression immediately softened. "Ah, such a little one, and the mother looks ready to fall down." "Mrs. Chen," Marcus said, standing and removing his hat respectfully, "this is Elena and her daughter Sofia. They're traveling to California, but their horse needs rest. I was just telling Elena that you might have some work for her, if she's interested." Mrs. Chen moved closer, her experienced eyes taking in Elena's exhausted state and Sofia's obvious contentment with the wooden horse. "Can you cook?" she asked directly. "Real cooking, not just beans and hardtack?" "Sí, señora," Elena replied, then corrected herself. "Yes, ma'am. I learned from my grandmother. Mexican food, American food. I can sew also, and clean." "Good," Mrs. Chen said with satisfaction. "I have 6 guests staying and 2 more expected tomorrow. The work is steady, but the pay is fair. 3 meals a day for you and the baby, plus $1 a day wages." She paused, studying Elena's face. "And a room of your own behind the kitchen where the little one can sleep safe." The offer was more generous than Elena had dared to hope for, and she found herself nodding before she had fully considered all the implications. "I would be grateful for the work, Senora." "Mrs. Chen," the older woman corrected with a slight smile, "and we start early. Breakfast is at 7, which means cooking begins at 6. She reached out to touch Sofia's cheek gently, earning a sleepy smile from the baby. "This one will be no trouble. Children bring good luck to a house." As the arrangements were finalized, Elena felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension settling over her. For the first time in weeks, she had a plan that extended beyond simple survival, a place to rest that did not require constant vigilance. But she also knew that staying in one place for any length of time increased the risk of discovery, and the thought of Diego Morales' men tracking her to this peaceful town filled her with dread. Marcus seemed to sense her inner conflict, though he made no direct comment about it. Instead, he busied himself with settling Estrella for the night, checking her water and adding fresh hay to her stall. The mare had finally relaxed completely, standing hip-shot in the comfortable pose of a horse that knew itself to be safe and cared for. "She'll be fine by morning," Marcus said quietly as Elena watched her horse with obvious concern. "A good night's rest, some decent feed, and she'll be ready for whatever comes next." Elena suspected that he was talking about more than just the horse, but she chose not to pursue the implication. Instead, she gathered her few belongings and followed Mrs. Chen toward the boarding house, Sofia drowsing against her shoulder as the evening air cooled around them. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a wide front porch, painted white with green trim that looked fresh and well-maintained. Mrs. Chen led them around to a side entrance that opened directly into a large, spotless kitchen where the lingering sense of the evening meal still hung in the air. "Your room is here," Mrs. Chen said, opening a door that revealed a small but comfortable space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a small garden. "The baby can sleep with you, or there is a cradle in the storage room if you prefer." Elena looked around the simple room with something approaching wonder. After weeks of sleeping rough or in the questionable accommodations of frontier way stations, the clean bed with its hand-stitched quilt looked like the height of luxury. More importantly, the room had only one entrance, which she could secure from the inside, and the window provided an alternative exit should the need arise. "It is perfect," she said sincerely. "Thank you for your kindness." Mrs. Chen nodded briskly, but Elena caught the pleased smile that touched the older woman's features. "There is water for washing, and clean towels in the dresser. Rest tonight, and tomorrow we will see what you can do with my kitchen." Alone in the room with Sofia, Elena finally allowed herself to truly relax for the first time in days. She washed both herself and her daughter in the basin of warm water that Mrs. Chen had provided, marveling at the simple luxury of soap and clean towels. Sofia, refreshed by the bath and still clutching her wooden horse, seemed more like her normal, cheerful self as Elena dressed her in a clean nightgown. As Elena tucked her daughter into the soft bed, Sofia looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "Mama," she said in her limited vocabulary, holding up the wooden horse. "Horse. Si, am I amor," Elena replied softly, smoothing the baby's dark hair. "The nice man gave you a horse. What do you say?" "Thank you," Sofia said solemnly, though the man who had given her the gift was not there to hear it. Elena smiled despite her exhaustion, struck by the resilience of children and their ability to find joy even in the midst of upheaval. As Sofia drifted off to sleep, the wooden horse still clasped in her small fist, Elena allowed herself to think beyond the immediate needs of survival for the first time since their flight began. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new fears, but tonight they were safe, fed, and clean. Tomorrow she would begin the work that would allow them to replenish their resources and give Estrella the rest she needed. And perhaps, if they were very careful and very lucky, they might be able to stay in this place of unexpected kindness long enough for Sofia to remember what it felt like to be a normal child again. As Elena finally allowed sleep to claim her, her last conscious thought was of Marcus Sullivan's quiet kindness and the way he had approached her frightened horse with such patience and understanding. In the morning, she would need to be careful not to reveal too much about her past or her reasons for fleeing. But tonight she could rest in the knowledge that there were still good people in the world, people who offered help without expecting anything in return. Outside her window, the sounds of Copper Canyon settling into evening quiet drifted through the cool air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and was silent. A horse whinnied softly from the direction of the livery stable, and Elena smiled drowsily as she recognized Estrella's voice among the night sounds. For the first time in weeks, she fell asleep without listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats or planning their next escape route. Tonight, at least, they were home. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness, pulling Elena from the deepest sleep she had experienced in weeks. For a disorienting moment, she could not remember where she was, her mind still caught between dreams of pursuit and the unfamiliar comfort of clean sheets. Then Sofia stirred beside her, the wooden horse still clutched in her tiny fist, and memory returned with the scent of wood smoke and bacon drifting through the boarding house walls. Elena dressed quickly in the dim light filtering through the small window, choosing her most practical dress and tying her long hair back with a strip of cloth. She had learned during her grandmother's tutelage that a kitchen demanded respect, and she intended to prove herself worthy of Mrs. Chen's trust from the very first morning. Sofia protested sleepily as Elena lifted her from the warm bed, but settled contentedly when her mother began humming a soft Spanish lullaby. The kitchen was already alive with activity when Elena emerged from her room. Mrs. Chen moved with practiced efficiency between the large cast-iron stove and a table laden with ingredients, her movements precise despite the early hour. The older woman looked up as Elena appeared, nodding approvingly at her prompt arrival. "Good, you are awake," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "Coffee is there, still hot. We have 8 guests this morning, plus Marcus will come for breakfast as he always does." She gestured toward a basket of eggs and slabs of bacon. "American breakfast today. Tomorrow we try something different. See what you can do." Elena settled Sofia in a corner where she could play safely with her wooden horse and a few kitchen implements that Mrs. Chen deemed harmless. The baby seemed fascinated by the bustle of activity around her, her dark eyes following every movement as Elena began working alongside her new employer. The rhythm of kitchen work was comforting in its familiarity. Elena had spent countless mornings helping her grandmother prepare meals for the ranch hands, learning to judge the heat of skillets by the sound of sizzling fat, and to crack eggs one-handed while stirring porridge with the other. Mrs. Chen watched her movements with sharp attention, but gradually relaxed as it became clear that Elena's claims of cooking experience had not been exaggerated. As the sun climbed higher, the boarding house began to stir with the sounds of guests preparing for their day. Elena heard boots on the stairs, the murmur of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter from the dining room. Mrs. Chen had explained that most of her guests were traveling salesmen, cattlemen passing through to the railhead, and occasionally a family relocating to one of the growing towns further west. Marcus arrived precisely at 7, removing his hat as he entered through the kitchen door, rather than the main entrance. Elena felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness as he appeared, though she could not quite explain why his presence should affect her so strongly. He had changed from his work clothes into a clean shirt and vest, and his hair showed signs of recent washing despite the early hour. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," he said, accepting the cup of coffee that the older woman pressed into his hands without being asked. His gaze found Elena at the stove, where she was turning bacon with careful attention. "Ma'am, I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you," Elena replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the way his presence seemed to fill the kitchen. "Your stable is very quiet at night." Marcus chuckled, moving to crouch beside Sofia, who immediately held up her wooden horse for his inspection. "Still taking good care of that, I see," he said gravely, examining the carving as if it were a matter of great importance. "Horses need looking after, even the wooden ones." Sofia babbled something incomprehensible but clearly approving, and Marcus nodded as if he understood every word. The gentle way he interacted with her daughter caused something to tighten in Elena's chest, a feeling she was not prepared to examine too closely. Mrs. Chen assigned Elena the task of carrying plates to the dining room, and she found herself face to face with the boarding house guests for the first time. Most were middle-aged men with the weathered look of those who spent their lives traveling rough country, but their manners were courteous as she served their breakfast. One guest, however, made her distinctly uncomfortable. He was younger than the others, perhaps 30, with pale eyes that followed her movements too closely, and a smile that never quite reached those eyes. When Elena set his plate before him, he caught her wrist lightly, his fingers lingering longer than necessary. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she could not place. "Mrs. Chen's got herself some fine help. You're new around here, aren't you, darling?" Elena pulled her hand free with a polite smile that masked her instinctive recoil. "I am just helping in the kitchen, senor. Please enjoy your breakfast." "Call me Jake," he said, still watching her with that unsettling intensity. "Jake Morrison. I'll be staying through the end of the week, so I'm sure we'll get better acquainted." Elena murmured something non-committal and escaped back to the kitchen, where Mrs. Chen immediately noticed her discomfort. The older woman's sharp eyes missed very little, and she had clearly observed the interaction through the serving window. "That one," Mrs. Chen said quietly, "you stay away from. Claims to be a cattle buyer, but his hands are too soft and his questions too many. I only let him stay because his money is good, but you watch yourself around him." The warning sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had developed a finely tuned sense for danger over the past weeks, and Jake Morrison triggered every instinct that had kept her alive during their flight. The possibility that he might be more than just an unpleasant guest was too frightening to contemplate. Marcus must have sensed something in her demeanor when she returned to the kitchen, because his expression grew serious as he studied her face. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, setting down his coffee cup. "Sigh, everything is fine," Elena replied quickly, but she saw from his expression that he was not convinced. Mrs. Chen's meaningful look in Morrison's direction was apparently all the explanation Marcus needed, because his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Morrison giving you trouble?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes hard. Elena shook her head, not wanting to create problems on her first morning. "No trouble, just unfamiliar faces, you understand." Marcus nodded, but Elena noticed that he lingered over his breakfast longer than seemed necessary, and that his position at the kitchen table gave him a clear view of the dining room through the serving window. When Morrison finally departed for whatever business occupied his days, Marcus relaxed visibly. The morning routine continued with Elena washing dishes, while Mrs. Chen prepared ingredients for the midday meal. Sofia had fallen asleep in her corner, exhausted by the excitement of new surroundings and the early hour. The sight of her daughter sleeping peacefully, the wooden horse still clasped in her hand, filled Elena with a bittersweet mixture of gratitude and grief for all that they had lost. As the kitchen quieted, Mrs. Chen poured herself a cup of tea and settled at the table with a sigh. "You work well," she observed, watching Elena hang the last of the cleaned pots on their hooks. "Your grandmother taught you properly." Elena smiled, pleased by the praise. She said a woman who could not feed people properly had no business calling herself a woman. "Cooking was important in our family." "Was?" Mrs. Chen asked gently, her tone inviting confidences without demanding them. Elena's hands stilled on the dish towel she was folding. She had not spoken of her family to anyone since beginning their flight, and the temptation to share her grief with someone who might understand was almost overwhelming. But caution had become second nature, and she forced herself to reveal only the safest portion of the truth. "My grandmother died 2 years ago," she said quietly. "My parents are also gone." It is just Sofia and me now." Mrs. Chen nodded with the understanding of someone who had also known loss. "Family is precious. Those who remain must protect each other." She paused, sipping her tea thoughtfully. Sometimes protection means staying in one place. Sometimes it means moving on. Only you can know which is right for your situation. The words carried a weight of meaning that suggested Mrs. Chen suspected more about Elena's circumstances than she was letting on. Elena found herself studying the older woman's face, wondering how much she had guessed, and whether that knowledge posed a threat or offered an opportunity for deeper trust. Marcus returned as they were beginning preparations for the noon meal, leading Estrella through the kitchen door with the casual confidence of someone who had done this many times before. The mare looked transformed from the panicked animal of the previous day, her coat gleaming and her manner calm as she followed Marcus into the kitchen. "Thought you might want to see how she's doing," Marcus said to Elena, stroking Estrella's neck affectionately. "She's been asking for you all morning." Elena could not help but smile at the obvious fabrication, but she was genuinely relieved to see her horse looking so much better. Estrella whickered softly when she saw Elena, nuzzling at her hands in search of treats. The mare's obvious contentment was reassuring, as horses were often better judges of character than humans. "She looks wonderful," Elena said, running her hands over Estrella's legs to check for any lingering effects of their hard journey. "You have taken excellent care of her." "She's good stock," Marcus replied, watching Elena's examination with professional interest. "Someone put a lot of time and money into her training. She's got cow sense, but she's been taught to work with a light hand. Not many horses can do both well." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implied question. Estrella's training was indeed exceptional, the result of 3 generations of careful breeding and patient work by Elena's grandfather and father. But explaining that would require admitting to a background that might draw unwanted attention to their presence in Copper Canyon. "My father loved horses," she said carefully. "He believed they should be partners, not servants." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Wise man. Too many folks think a horse is just something to climb on and go. Takes real understanding to develop a partnership like you two obviously have." Sofia chose that moment to wake from her nap, and her delighted squeal at seeing Estrella in the kitchen brought smiles to all the adults. The baby held out her wooden horse toward the real one, babbling explanations that only she understood, but that seemed to satisfy her completely when Estrella lowered her head to sniff delicately at the toy. Mrs. Chen watched the interaction with obvious pleasure. "Children and horses," she observed, "both know when they are safe, and both remember kindness." Marcus spent another hour in the kitchen, ostensibly discussing Estrella's care, but clearly reluctant to leave. Elena found herself hyper-aware of his presence, the way he moved with quiet confidence through the familiar space, his gentle manner with both Sofia and the horse. When he finally departed to return to his own work, the kitchen seemed somehow emptier despite Mrs. Chen's continuing presence. The afternoon brought a steady stream of boarding house guests returning for their midday meal, and Elena was kept busy serving and clearing plates. She noticed that Jake Morrison watched her with the same unsettling intensity as that morning, his pale eyes following her movements around the dining room. When she bent to refill his coffee cup, he leaned closer than necessary. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about you all morning. There's something familiar about you, like maybe we've met before." Elena's blood turned to ice, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I do not think so, senor. I would remember." Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. "Maybe not me personally, but perhaps someone who looks like me? Someone who might have been asking questions about a young Mexican woman traveling with a baby?" The coffee pot trembled in Elena's hands, and she had to grip it more tightly to keep from dropping it. Morrison's words could only mean one thing. He was connected to Diego Morales and the men who had destroyed her family's ranch. The casual way he revealed his knowledge told her that he believed himself to be in complete control of the situation. "I am sure I do not know what you mean," Elena replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Morrison chuckled, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a folded piece of paper. He held it just long enough for Elena to see that it was a wanted poster bearing a crude but recognizable sketch of her face before tucking it away again. $500, he said conversationally. That's what you're worth to certain interested parties. Of course, they want you alive and unharmed, which gives us some room for negotiation. His pale eyes glittered with malicious amusement. I'm a reasonable man, Elena Vasquez. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement that benefits us both. Elena's mind raced as she tried to calculate her options. Morrison obviously knew exactly who she was, which meant that staying in Copper Canyon was no longer safe. But leaving immediately would mean abandoning Estrella before the mare was fully recovered, and traveling on foot with Sofia would be virtually impossible. Worse, Morrison's casual confidence suggested that he had already taken steps to prevent her escape. I think you have mistaken me for someone else, Elena said, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. My name is Elena Moreno, and I am traveling to California to join my husband's family. Morrison's laugh was genuinely amused. All that's good, very good. Elena Moreno instead of Elena Vasquez. But the baby's the same, and so is that quality horse you rode into town. Details like that are hard to change, even for someone as clever as you've proven to be. Elena set the coffee pot down with exaggerated care, her mind working frantically. Morrison's knowledge was too detailed to be coincidental, which meant that Diego Morales' reach was far longer than she had hoped. But the bounty hunter's obvious confidence in his position might also provide an opportunity if she could find a way to turn it against him. What do you want? She asked quietly, abandoning the pretense that she did not understand his meaning. Morrison's smile widened. Now that's more like it. Direct and honest, just like the lady I was told to expect. He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying his position of power. What I want is simple. You come with me willingly. No fuss. No attempts to run or fight. In return, I guarantee your safety and the child's during the journey back to New Mexico. Elena's stomach clenched at the thought of returning to face Diego Morales, but she forced herself to keep listening. Information might be her only weapon in this situation. And if I refuse? She asked. Morrison shrugged casually. Then I take you anyway, but the terms won't be nearly as comfortable. The bounty poster says, alive and unharmed. But it doesn't specify much beyond that. A woman who's been fighting and causing trouble might need to be restrained for her own safety. The implicit threat was clear, and Elena felt sick at the thought of Sofia witnessing such treatment. But something in Morrison's manner suggested that he was not as confident as he appeared. If he could simply take her by force, why was he bothering with negotiations at all? How long do I have to consider your offer? Elena asked, stalling for time while she tried to think of alternatives. Morrison pulled out a pocket watch, consulting it with theatrical precision. Well, it's past noon now. I'd say you have until sunset to make your decision. That gives you plenty of time to think it over. Maybe discuss it with your new friends. His pale eyes glittered with malicious amusement. Though I should mention that involving others would be unwise. Accidents happen when people interfere with legal business. Elena's blood ran cold at the implied threat to Marcus and Mrs. Chen. Morrison had clearly done his research thoroughly, understanding exactly which pressure points would be most effective. The thought of bringing harm to the people who had shown her such kindness was almost as unbearable as the prospect of capture. I understand, Elena said quietly, though her mind was already racing through possibilities for escape or resistance. Morrison nodded approvingly. I thought you might. You're obviously an intelligent woman, which is why I'm sure you'll make the right choice. He stood, dropping a coin on the table to pay for his meal. Until sunset, then. I'll be waiting in my room. Elena watched him leave with a mixture of hatred and fear, her hands trembling as she cleared the remaining dishes from his table. The dining room suddenly felt like a trap, its windows offering views of escape routes that Morrison had undoubtedly already considered and blocked. The other guests continued their conversations, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded under their noses. Mrs. Chen appeared at Elena's elbow, her dark eyes sharp with concern. What did that man say to you? She asked quietly, taking the stack of plates from Elena's shaking hands. Elena looked around the dining room, confirming that they were alone except for one elderly cattle buyer who was absorbed in his newspaper. He knows who I am, she whispered. He has a bounty poster with my picture. Mrs. Chen's expression hardened, and Elena was reminded that this woman had survived decades in a frontier territory where survival often depended on quick thinking and decisive action. "How much time did he give you?" "Until sunset to agree to go with him willingly." Elena's voice caught as she continued. "He threatened harm to others if I involve anyone in my problems." Mrs. Chen snorted derisively. "Empty threat. Man like that wants no witnesses, no complications. He threatens others to keep you isolated, make you think you have no choices." The older woman's eyes glittered with an anger that surprised Elena. "Men like him think women are helpless, that we will surrender rather than fight." Elena stared at her employer, seeing something in the woman's manner that suggested personal experience with such situations. "Mrs. Chen, I cannot bring danger to your house. Perhaps it would be better if I simply—" "If you simply what?" Mrs. Chen interrupted sharply. "Give up. Let him take you and the baby back to whatever evil sent him looking?" She shook her head firmly. "I have seen what happens to women who trust the promises of bad men. They keep only the promises that serve their purposes." Elena felt tears threatening as the hopelessness of her situation threatened to overwhelm her. "But what choice do I have? I cannot fight him alone, and I will not risk harm to you or Marcus or anyone else because of my problems." Mrs. Chen set down the plates with a decisive click. "First, you are not alone unless you choose to be. Second, some problems are everyone's problems when they arrive in your community." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Third, you may have more friends than you realize." Elena looked at the older woman questioningly, but Mrs. Chen simply nodded toward the kitchen. "Come, we have work to do and plans to make. But first, you must tell me exactly what kind of man is hunting you and why." In the privacy of the kitchen, with Sofia playing contentedly nearby, Elena found herself telling Mrs. Chen the whole story for the first time. She spoke of her family's ranch, of Diego Morales' attempts to steal their land through false claims and intimidation, of the night her grandfather had been murdered and the ranch burned. Most importantly, she revealed the existence of the legal documents hidden in her belongings, papers that proved Morales' crimes, and could send him to prison if they ever reached the territorial authorities. Mrs. Chen listened without interruption, her expression growing grimmer as the tale unfolded. When Elena finished, the older woman sat in silence for several long moments, clearly weighing options and possibilities. "These papers," Mrs. Chen said finally. "They are hidden safely?" Elena nodded, touching the seam of her dress where the documents were sewn into the fabric itself. "Even if Morrison searches my belongings, he will not find them easily." Mrs. Chen smiled grimly. "Good. Then he does not know the real reason Morales wants you back so badly. He thinks it is only about revenge or silencing a witness." Elena felt a flicker of hope at the older woman's tone. "You think the papers make a difference?" "I think," Mrs. Chen said carefully, "that some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some fights are too important to avoid." She stood, moving to the window that looked out toward the livery stable. "Marcus should know about this, and there are others in town who might be interested in helping bring a man like Morales to justice." Elena's heart pounded at the suggestion of involving more people in her dangerous situation. "Mrs. Chen, Morrison was very clear about what would happen if I involve others. I cannot be responsible for harm coming to innocent people." Mrs. Chen turned from the window, her expression fierce. "Child, you think too small. Morrison is one man, probably working alone because bounty hunters do not like to share their rewards. But we are a community, and communities protect their own when threatened." The older woman moved to a cabinet, withdrawing what looked like an ordinary rolling pin, but handling it in a way that suggested it might serve other purposes. "Besides," she added with a grim smile, "Morrison may find that the people of Copper Canyon are not as helpless as he assumes." Elena stared at Mrs. Chen, seeing her in an entirely new light. The capable boarding house keeper was clearly more than she appeared, and Elena began to suspect that Copper Canyon itself might hold more surprises than a simple frontier town should possess. As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared at the kitchen door, his expression serious as he took in the tension that filled the room. "Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, "I just had an interesting conversation with Tom Bradley at the general store. Seems our friend Morrison was asking a lot of questions about recent arrivals in town. Mrs. Chen nodded grimly. Elena has something to tell you. Something that changes everything. As Elena began to repeat her story for Marcus, she found herself hoping that Mrs. Chen was right about the people of Copper Canyon. Because sunset was approaching rapidly, and Morrison would not wait much longer for her answer. Marcus listened to Elena's story with growing tension. His weathered hands clenched into fists as she described the night her family's ranch had burned and her grandfather's murder. When she finished speaking, the kitchen fell silent except for Sofia's contented babbling as she played with her wooden horse, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding them. $500, Marcus said quietly, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's what Morrison thinks you're worth to this Morales character. Elena nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I should never have stayed. I have brought this danger to your town, to people who showed me only kindness. Mrs. Chen made a sharp sound of disagreement. Nonsense. Evil follows its own path, and it would have found us eventually whether you were here or not. Better to face it with purpose than to let it surprise us later. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the main street. Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand unconsciously moved toward the gun belt he wore even during his daily work. Morrison's been asking questions all over town, he said grimly. Tom Bradley told me the man was particularly interested in anyone who might have arrived recently with a horse of unusual quality. Elena's heart sank as she realized how thoroughly Morrison had researched her trail. He knows about Estrella's breeding. That was foolish of me, to think such details would not be noticed. Your horse's quality isn't the problem, Marcus replied, turning back to face her. The problem is that Morrison thinks he can walk into our town and threaten our people without consequences. Mrs. Chen smiled grimly at Marcus's words. Exactly what I told her. Morrison may know about bounty hunting, but he does not know about Copper Canyon. Elena looked between them, sensing undercurrents in their conversation that she did not fully understand. What do you mean? Marcus exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Chen before settling back at the kitchen table. Copper Canyon isn't exactly what it appears to be, he said carefully. Most of the people who've settled here have reasons for preferring a quiet life away from territorial authorities. Mrs. Chen nodded, pouring fresh coffee for all of them despite the afternoon heat. Not outlaws, you understand, but people who value their privacy, who look out for each other when trouble comes calling. Elena felt a flicker of hope, though she was afraid to let it grow too strong. You think people would help me against Morrison? I think, Marcus said slowly, that people would help protect a woman and child from a man who threatens violence in their town, especially when that woman has legal papers that could bring a murderer to justice. Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. These documents you carry, they are proof of Morales's crimes? Elena touched the hidden seam of her dress where the papers lay concealed. Deeds, contracts, witness statements that my grandfather gathered before his death. Everything needed to prove that Morales used false claims and violence to steal land from multiple families. Marcus whistled softly. That's why Morales wants you back so badly. It's not just about revenge, it's about survival. Those papers could destroy him. Which means, Mrs. Chen added thoughtfully, that Morrison probably doesn't know their true value. He thinks he's chasing a simple fugitive, not someone carrying evidence that could hang his employer. Elena dared to feel genuine hope for the first time since Morrison had revealed himself. But even if the town would help, Morrison is armed and dangerous. I will not have blood spilled because of my troubles. Marcus smiled grimly. Who said anything about blood? Morrison's operating under the assumption that he's dealing with helpless frontier folk who'll cave to intimidation. He's about to learn otherwise. As if summoned by their conversation, the kitchen door opened to admit Tom Bradley, the general store owner, followed by two other men Elena had not previously met. All three wore the casual confidence of men accustomed to handling problems with direct action. Mrs. Chen, Tom said, touching his hat respectfully. Marcus, we heard there might be some trouble brewing. Marcus gestured toward chairs around the large kitchen table. Tom, meet Elena and her daughter Sofia. Elena, this is Tom Bradley, Sam Tucker, who runs the bank, and Father Miguel from the church. Elena was surprised to see a priest among the group, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of physical labor beyond his religious duties. Sam Tucker was a compact man with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to making quick decisions about risk and opportunity. "We've been discussing the situation with Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "Elena has information that could be very valuable to the territorial authorities, but Morrison intends to take her back to the man she's fleeing from." Father Miguel leaned forward, his expression concerned. "A man who murdered her grandfather and burned her family's ranch," he said quietly. "I heard about the Vasquez ranch in New Mexico. Terrible business, and the authorities never found who was responsible." Elena stared at him in shock. "You know about my family?" The priest nodded gravely. "Word travels along the mission circuit. Several families fled the area after the Vasquez place burned, all telling similar stories about a man named Morales forcing people off their land through violence and false legal claims." Sam Tucker pulled out a leather portfolio, setting it on the table with decisive authority. "I've been corresponding with territorial officials about suspicious land transfers in New Mexico. They've been building a case against Morales for months, but they need witnesses and documentation." Elena's heart began to pound as the full implications of their words sank in. "You mean the authorities are already investigating Morales?" "More than investigating," Tom Bradley said grimly. "There's a federal marshal on his way to Santa Fe to arrest Morales, but he needs solid evidence to make the charges stick." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Which means Elena isn't running from the law, she's running toward it. Morrison just doesn't know it yet." Mrs. Chen clapped her hands together with satisfaction. "Perfect. Now we simply need to keep Elena safe, until the proper authorities can take custody of her evidence." Elena felt dizzy with the sudden reversal of her situation. After weeks of believing herself to be a hunted fugitive, she was discovering that she might actually be a crucial witness in a federal investigation. "But Morrison still expects an answer by sunset," she said, "and he still has the advantage of surprise." Father Miguel smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "Actually, I think Mr. Morrison is about to lose that advantage entirely." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jake Morrison made his way down the stairs of the boarding house, confident that Elena would have reached the only sensible conclusion about her situation. He had spent the afternoon cleaning his weapons and reviewing his plans for the journey back to New Mexico, anticipating no real difficulty in collecting his bounty. The dining room was unusually crowded for the early evening hour, but Morrison paid little attention to the other occupants, as he settled at his usual table to wait for Elena's surrender. It was only when he looked around more carefully that he began to notice something odd about the gathering. Tom Bradley sat at one table, ostensibly reading a newspaper but clearly watching Morrison over the top of the pages. Sam Tucker occupied another table, papers spread before him as if conducting business, but his attention was also focused on the bounty hunter. Father Miguel sat quietly in the corner, his breviary open in his hands, but his eyes alert and watchful. Morrison's confidence began to waver as he realized that every man in the room was positioned to observe his movements. When Marcus Sullivan entered through the kitchen door, moving with the predatory grace of a man prepared for violence, Morrison understood that his situation had changed dramatically. Elena appeared moments later, carrying a tray of coffee, as if this were simply another evening of serving boarding house guests. But Morrison could see the difference in her bearing, the way she held herself with newfound confidence instead of the fear that had marked their earlier encounter. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said formally, setting a cup before him with steady hands. "I believe you were expecting my answer." Morrison glanced around the room, noting the way every conversation had quietly ceased, and all attention was focused on their interaction. "Seems like you've been talking to people about our private business," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Elena smiled, the expression holding no warmth whatsoever. "I have indeed been talking to people. Very interesting conversations, as it turns out." Sam Tucker rose from his table, moving to stand beside Elena, with the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Sam Tucker, president of the Copper Canyon Bank. I've been authorized by the territorial government to inform you that Mrs. Vasquez is under federal protection as a material witness in an ongoing investigation. Morrison's face went pale as the implications hit him. That's impossible. She's a fugitive. Wanted for... For what, exactly? Father Miguel asked mildly, closing his breviary and rising to join the group. Perhaps you could show us the legal warrant that authorizes your pursuit of this woman. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but stopped when he realized that Marcus had positioned himself to block any quick draw. Tom Bradley had also risen, and Morrison found himself surrounded by men who were clearly prepared for whatever action he might take. I have a legitimate bounty contract, Morrison said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Sam Tucker held out his hand expectantly. Then you won't mind showing it to us, along with any territorial authorization for operating as a bounty hunter in Arizona. Morrison's silence stretched long enough to confirm what everyone in the room had already suspected. His pursuit of Elena was based on nothing more than a private arrangement with Diego Morales, carrying no legal authority whatsoever. Elena stepped forward, her voice clear and strong as she spoke. Mr. Morrison, I have something that might interest you. She reached into her dress, withdrawing the carefully preserved documents that had been sewn into the fabric. These are legal papers proving that Diego Morales murdered my grandfather and stole our family's land through fraud and violence. Morrison stared at the documents as if they were poisonous snakes. Those papers mean nothing without a court to hear them. Father Miguel smiled. Actually, they mean quite a lot to Federal Marshal Harrison, who should be arriving in Santa Fe any day now to arrest Morales on charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The color drained completely from Morrison's face as he realized that he had been working for a man who was about to become a federal fugitive. Worse, his own actions in pursuing Elena could be construed as obstruction of justice or conspiracy after the fact. Marcus stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Seems to me you have a choice to make, Morrison. You can ride out of town tonight and hope the federal authorities don't take an interest in your business with Morales. Or you can keep pushing and find out what happens to men who threaten women and children in our town. Morrison looked around the room, seeing nothing but hard faces and steady hands. Whatever advantage he had thought to possess through intimidation had evaporated completely. This isn't over, he said finally, though the words carried no real conviction. Tom Bradley laughed, the sound cold and dismissive. Actually, it is over. Morales will be in federal custody within days, which means your bounty contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. Even if you somehow manage to get Mrs. Vasquez back to New Mexico, there'd be no one there to pay you. Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You people have no idea what you're interfering with. Mrs. Chen appeared from the kitchen, carrying a carpet bag that Morrison recognized as his own luggage. Your bill is settled, she said crisply, setting the bag at his feet. The evening stage leaves for Tucson in 1 hour. I suggest you be on it. Morrison looked around the room one last time, seeing nothing but implacable resolve in every face. With a curse, he grabbed his bag and stalked toward the door, his boots echoing loudly in the sudden silence. Marcus followed him outside, and Elena could hear the low murmur of voices as the two men spoke privately on the porch. When Marcus returned, his expression was grim but satisfied. He'll leave, Marcus said simply. Morrison's smart enough to know when he's beaten. Elena sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak with relief. Is it really over? Can it be that simple? Sam Tucker began gathering his papers, his manner businesslike but kind. It's not quite over yet. You'll need to travel to Santa Fe to meet with Marshal Harrison and turn over your evidence formally. But yes, the danger is past. Father Miguel moved to where Sofia sat playing contentedly on the floor, her wooden horse still clutched in her small hands. This little one will grow up knowing that justice exists, even in dark times. That's a precious gift. Elena felt tears threatening as the full impact of her changed situation began to sink in. After months of running and hiding, of living in constant fear for Sofia's safety, they were finally free. More than free, they were going to be part of bringing Diego Morales to justice for his crimes. Mrs. Chen bustled about, clearing away coffee cups and restoring the dining room to its normal evening quiet. Tomorrow we will discuss your travel arrangements to Santa Fe, she said to Elena. Tonight you rest. Both of you have earned peaceful sleep. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, Elena found herself alone with Marcus in the kitchen. Sofia had fallen asleep in her corner, exhausted by the day's excitement, and the wooden horse lay beside her small hand. "I don't know how to thank you," Elena said quietly, looking up into Marcus's steady gaze. "All of you risked so much to help us." Marcus moved closer, his expression serious. "Elena, there's something I need to say, and I'm not sure how you'll receive it." Elena's heart began to pound, though she could not have said whether from hope or fear. "What is it?" Marcus removed his hat, running his fingers through his hair in a gesture that suggested nervousness. "When this business with the marshal is finished, when you've given your testimony, and Morales is in prison, you'll be free to go anywhere you choose." Elena nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I was hoping," Marcus said carefully, "that you might choose to come back here. To Copper Canyon." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Marcus, I know it's too soon," he continued quickly. "I know you need time to grieve properly for your family, to decide what kind of life you want to build for yourself and Sofia, but I want you to know that when you're ready, there's a place for both of you here." Elena looked around the kitchen that had become so familiar in just 2 days, thinking of Mrs. Chen's kindness and the way the townspeople had rallied to protect her and Sofia. "What kind of place?" she asked softly. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Any kind you want. Mrs. Chen would love to have you stay on permanently. Help her run the boarding house. The town needs a teacher for the children. Or," he paused, meeting her eyes directly, "or you could let me court you properly. See if what I think is growing between us might become something more." Elena felt her cheeks warm, but she did not look away. "And Sofia?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Sofia already has me wrapped around her little finger, and she knows it. She'd be my daughter in every way that matters, if you'd allow it." Elena looked down at her sleeping child, thinking of all the dreams that had died with her family's ranch, and all the new possibilities that were opening before them. "I will need time," she said finally. "Time to finish this business with the authorities, time to mourn what we lost." "All the time you need," Marcus replied. "I'm a patient man, Elena, and some things are worth waiting for." Elena moved to where Sofia lay sleeping, gently lifting her daughter into her arms. The baby stirred but did not wake, her small hand still clutching the wooden horse that had become her most treasured possession. "When I first arrived here," Elena said quietly, "I thought we were running toward nothing but more danger and uncertainty. I never imagined we might be running toward home." Marcus reached out to touch Sofia's dark hair with gentle fingers. "Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as disasters. If you hadn't been running from Morales, you never would have found Copper Canyon." Elena smiled, feeling a peace settle over her that she had not experienced in months. "And if Estrella hadn't been spooked by the thunder, we might have ridden right through town without stopping." "Well then," Marcus said with a chuckle, "I'll have to remember to thank that thunderstorm." As Elena carried Sofia toward their room, she paused at the kitchen door to look back at Marcus. "When we return from Santa Fe," she said softly, "we'll talk about the future, about all the possibilities." Marcus nodded, his eyes warm with promise. "I'll be here waiting." Elena settled Sofia into the comfortable bed, the wooden horse still clasped safely in her daughter's small fist. As she prepared for sleep herself, Elena allowed her mind to wander toward the future for the first time in months. Tomorrow would bring the journey to Santa Fe and the formal end of Diego Morales' reign of terror. But after that, there would be new beginnings, new choices, and new hope. She thought of Marcus's patient kindness, of Mrs. Chen's fierce protection, of the way an entire town had rallied to defend strangers in need. Perhaps Sofia would grow up here, playing with other children while her mother taught school or helped run the boarding house. Perhaps there would be more children eventually, brothers and sisters for Sofia to love and protect. As sleep finally claimed her, Elena's last conscious thought was of the wooden horse in Sofia's hand, carved with love by a man who understood that children needed something to hold on to, something that was just theirs. Tomorrow they would begin the journey toward justice, but tonight they were home at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.